I'm joined by two leaders who push innovation from very different angles. Jeff Melanson is a technology innovator showing how tools like AI and digital twins can reimagine entire industries. And Mark Patterson works at the edge of workforce and technology, building national platforms and partnerships that bring innovation to scale across Canada's whole talent ecosystem. Together, we'll ask, how does Canada's identity shape the future of talent? I'm Emily Madden, and this is the MNL Show. Hello. So today I want to talk about technology and innovation and how industries are changing. You two are the absolute right people to have this conversation with. Jeff, Mark, thank you so much for being here. As I mentioned, I want to talk about technology and innovation industry, how things are changing. But what I really am interested in understanding today is, how do Canadians see ourselves? And what does that actually mean for the future of talent vis-a-vis all of these changing industries? So while we're talking about the same future of work conversation that we're having, kind of in many different settings that we're having these conversations, I'm really interested to understand, what does the Canadian identity have to do with this? How does it play into this picture?
Well, it's a good question. I think the challenge that we all have with innovation is innovation requires upsetting past practice, right? So there has to be a willingness to look at what you're doing now and say, how could I do that differently? How have some of the underlying assumptions of what I've built to date changed? And what new opportunities might exist? So everybody, Canadian or otherwise, struggles with that because we're proud of what we did yesterday. And it's hard for us to reimagine it. So step one is kind of being open to that conversation. And then I think the other challenge Canada has, and I'll tell you this like short anecdote. When I was younger, I know you're looking at me now and thinking, wow, he's super young. But when I was a lot younger, earlier in my career, I remember talking to a very successful business person, and I won't name names, but I was talking about innovation. I said, well, why isn't Canada better at this? Because we're not great at it in 2025, but we weren't great at it in 2010 either. So this is like a long time ago. And this person said to me, the thing about Canada is we wait to see another country do something successful, largely the US, for 5 to 10 years, and then we copy it. And a lot of our successful business people have built successful businesses based on taking things that have been proven somewhere else and then replicating it in the small market that is Canada. Now, that's not innovation, that's duplicating someone else's idea in a new market. So I think the last 100 years, we've had this sort of slow pace of change that has allowed us to do that. And the difference now is change is happening so quickly. And to be innovative, you have to be a risk taker. And if you're waiting for someone else to prove something out before you try it, inherently you're not. So I think we have to change both our attachment to the past and legacy in some ways, but also be willing to be bold, take risks, be the first, or be the second at least, and not be way behind everybody else.
So you're tapping onto something that I think is fairly known, this kind of Canadian consensus building. And I think, you're kind of tapping into this idea that we are careful adapters, right? And maybe geographically there's a reason why we can be, or maybe it has something to do with our history and our constitution, how we became Canada, right? In terms of kind of different groups working together to try and build something. What about you, Mark? Do you see us as careful, kind of risk averse? Do you see us as innovators? How do you see kind of Canadians? And I think you might see it from a slightly different perspective, if I recall.
Yeah, I think, I largely agree with Jeff, which is sometimes surprising. But I think the issue is there's a sense of complacency. And I think that comes from, we live in a country where we have a lot of advantages. We have a lot of natural resources. We have a lot of talent. We have but there's a complacency there's not a sense of hunger to compete, to achieve, to advance. So we have this kind of paradox where we're kind of one of the top 3 countries in the world, for example, in AI researchers, research scientists. Like we really invented a lot of the technological advances in AI, but we're ranked very low in adoption of AI to drive our industries, to support our economy. So I think there is something really interesting here where there's no hunger. And maybe that comes from a sense of abundance or complacency. Not exactly sure.
It's interesting. So I'm going to push you guys both on this particular question. So if we think about Canadians, do you think Canadians see ourselves as complacent and lacking hunger and not innovative? Or do you think we actually see ourselves as those things and you two are recognizing that maybe we're not as much those things as we think we are?
There was another example of a lesson I learned young when I first went to China. I spent some time with a Canadian who'd built his business over in China and left Canada. And he said sometimes he felt that Canadians fall in love with a narrative that may not be true.
Okay.
And I think one of the, I totally agree with Mark's perspective, although I might differ slightly, because I think the attachment to great AI researchers of the past, and like they're incredible, like Geoffrey Hinton's a great example. Like we do have some interesting creators of concept and idea around AI to pick one technology. But I don't think we're as strong in those spaces as other people would see us. Like, I don't think the world looks at Canada and says, wow, Canada is really a birthplace of AI. We might tell ourselves that, and I don't think the world sees us that way. And then I think our unwillingness sometimes to compare ourselves with other countries and say, well, why aren't we doing better? Like, I always wonder, because I hear a lot of Canadians say, well, you talk a lot about American innovation, and we're such a small country, we can't compete with the States. And yet you look at like the Nordic and Baltic countries, which if you add the 8 countries' populations together, it's less than Canada. And they kill it. Like they have top tier, the Ericssons, the Spotifys, like they have company upon Nokia, company upon company upon company that's global relevance. Why is Canada not doing that? And I think, I do agree with, with the basis of your question. I think Canadians think they're innovative leaders, but I just don't think we are. And I think we got to light a fire under ourselves right now and get going. And I think the more we tell ourselves, we're not that bad. We got Geoffrey Hinton was here. That's not good enough. Like the application's got to be there. We got to move. And this technology is so profound. It's like I look back at human history, right? Obviously, this is going to be more disruptive than the Industrial Revolution or the printing press. But we as humans have been through these waves of innovation before, and they change everything. And I'm like, I just don't think it's good enough for Canada to sit back and say, well, we're not that bad. It's going okay, or we'll see what happens. Like, this is not the time to sit back in that way. So I think there is a complacency that is dangerous.
To this point, I think the difference this time is that the time between, like, say, AI adoption being a comparable, like, competitive advantage to being an absolute necessity is really short. Right, so
can you unpack that, Mark?
Yeah, so I think in other technologies, we could go through many, but say electricity or other things, there was a fairly long period of time to figure out how to adapt it. We're sitting in a building that was built as a manufacturing facility probably before electricity, which is why you have big windows and interior courtyards and so on. We didn't learn how to use or redesign the way we did things for many, kind of decades. We didn't electrify all of our tools for decades. But I think the rate of and the pace of change is so rapid in this technological wave that the time from being like having an advantage of being a early adopter to it being an absolute necessity to be able to compete in the industry you're in is much more compressed than it has been historically.
So it's not, the question of, is our style helping us? Is it hindering us? I think is kind of evident from your answers. You're feeling, both of you, a necessity for us to kind of do something about this. And you said, Jeff, that these technologies are going to be, truly profound. That word, I think, is probably a good word to use, truly profound. In your work in digital transformation, what technologies do you see reshaping the future of work the most? And specifically, when we think about skills and talent, like, what are you really seeing? Give us some kind of practical examples.
We tend to think of tech, I think historically we've thought about technologies on a technology by technology basis, right? So we hear a lot of conversation now about robotics and EVs and autonomous vehicles and digital twins. And these things are shared as if they're, it's almost like the old, for people that are old enough to remember this, the old record store where you had like different sections of the record store. It's like different sections of technology. They're not different. They're all interconnected, these technologies. So I think the thing that people are missing is they get excited about one of them and don't realize the impact that they all have collectively. So the example I would use is like on the robotics side, which people understand, I think, what a robot is from maybe sci-fi or maybe they've seen one. But when you start to bake AI into the robotic strategy, where your robot becomes embodied AI, and AI can go from like not an LLM, not living in the ether, but living in the real world and interacting with you. That's a pretty significant change, right? And you're already at the point, Amazon has more robots than employees. Like we're already there.
Right.
That's not like a distant future. And I hear people talk like, oh, you know, in 10 years, I wouldn't be surprised if we see more robots. I'm like, are you paying attention to what's happening now? Or, you know, another great example, I was at a EU gathering, so we're not just picking on Canada here. And the EU has a great reputation of over-regulating things. And this is 2 years ago. And they were talking about autonomous vehicles. And on the panel, a bunch of specialists were asked, how soon do you think we have to be ready for this? And they're like, 2035, 2040. And yet, meanwhile, Waymo is already on the streets of San Francisco. Like you already have, I think at that point, 7 million self-driving miles by autonomous vehicles. And yet the policymakers are talking about like a 10 or 12 year horizon on being prepared for this. So, you know, autonomous is obviously a major change. To get back to your question, robots, digital twinning, digital transformation, like these things are being adopted at such a speed around the world. And I just don't think Canadians are aware of that.
And they are not just coming for tech jobs. They're coming, the kind of automation, the changes are coming in every industry is kind of what you're highlighting.
Yes, yeah, there's not, in the work that we do with Unity and digital transformation, there is not a sector that we're not involved in at this point in terms of transforming, like how, whether it's healthcare, biomanufacturing, aerospace. There's a space engineering program I'm working with right now talking about how we use digital twins to model agriculture and outer space. Like everything that exists today and everything that could exist is already engaged in these technologies.
Mark, you look like you want to add on that one.
No, I just think, you know, in a lot of the conversations I'm having across the country, even internationally, like people are thinking of AI as ChatGPT, right? Like that's the touch point that the vast majority of the population has. But it's far more than that. And it's affecting every single technology in every single industry and every single process and will affect every single role. And people don't know how fast it's changing. Like, we are in an exponential growth curve. I think I was mentioning today in another session, David Sachs, the crypto and AI senior policy advisor to the Trump administration, made a statement like AI will be 1 million times more powerful within the next 4 years than it is today. And it's because of the massive build out of the data centers, which we're hearing about every week now, the increase in the GPUs and chips, and the rapid advancement in the algorithms. So that will not only affect your chatbot, it's going to affect every single job and every single technology in every single industry.
Canada's workforce ecosystem, you're talking about traveling across the country, and I know you travel globally as well to have these kinds of conversations. But obviously, from both of you, I'm hearing we're under major pressure to adapt. Can you talk a little bit about where we're doing, maybe making some progress in this? Where are we doing well? And where do you see us kind of falling behind in terms of adapting to these new systems that are coming in? Is it just ChatGPT?
Well, I think I'd like to go back to something Jeff mentioned early on, is like we have the benefit, and I'm pretty proud to be a Canadian, like we have an amazing country with, you know, we had a post-secondary system that, you know, we can be proud of, a K-12 education. The challenge is that what got us here won't get us there, so to speak. You know, there's a quote I think about a lot right now, which is, and I think it was Peter Drucker that said, in times of turbulence, the greatest danger is not the turbulence, it is actually doing things the way you've always done them, right? So Clayton Christensen, the Harvard professor that wrote The Innovator's Dilemma and so on, had a very similar quote, which, if we continue to do things that made us successful, it's basically not going to work in the future. So we're in a society where we have established a pretty strong, good society, relatively. But what we see in some of the AI transformation, you look at the OpenAI data that came out this week, other countries, emerging economies are adopting even ChatGPT at 4 times the speed of advanced economies. If you look at AI literacy and trust, we're 47th or 44th out of 47 countries based on a recent KPMG study. So what is causing that? I think, again, it's part of the privilege we've enjoyed over the last 100 years. But the question we need to be asking ourselves is, the future. And I don't think the potential disruption that I believe we will go through is, it's not necessarily, I wouldn't blame AI. I would actually blame a lack of leadership in a time of AI, because that's where I think we have a real challenge.
Okay, so we're kind of teetering around this sort of edge of foreshadowing a problem, or ringing the alarm bell that we're not keeping up at a pace that we should. But let's go all the way there, at risk of kind of horrifying all of us in the conversation. What is actually at risk? What is the problem if we don't respond fast enough? Like, practically, if Canada does not bridge this, what's going to happen? What's the issue?
Well, I think we've seen it in the last 20 years where our productivity per capita is down, our economic success is down relative to other countries, right? So you're going to see a future Canadian economy that's even bleaker than the one we live in today, which is relatively speaking, bleaker than it was 20 years ago. So whether or not we want to acknowledge it or not, Canada's economy has faltered over the last decades, and that will get worse. But I want to flip it the other way. I want to focus on the positive for a sec.
Optimism
and say, I love the idea, when I ran companies, there's an accounting concept of zero-based accounting, which is basically you take your budget for the next year, you net everything back to zero, and then you recreate a budget entirely. And the advantage of that is often your budgets from year to year, you just start adjusting last year's budget, and at some point, you're enough years in the future, you're like, what are the foundations of this budget? I don't even understand it. I like zero-based strategy. So I'm like, if you looked at Canada and you said, what if we could reset today? Just reset, recognize the time we're in, and try to figure out what assets do we have that could position us really well for the future. And I think the reality is, from an energy perspective, we could be an energy powerhouse. We should be. It's insane that we're not. We need to focus on that area in terms of development. To Mark's point, we have a great post-secondary and education infrastructure. And in fact, the fact we have centralized control, the old Commonwealth structures where you have a minister of education or a minister of colleges and universities, you can aggregate those institutions in a way that you can't do in the States. You can't do in lots of other countries, right? So if we have the right idea, we can scale it in a way that other countries can't scale. So in terms of transforming our workforce, we have that advantage. We have rare earths, we have mining. We have so many advantages in Canada. And part of what gets me so frustrated is I'm watching it falter and I'm like, man, where's the leadership to grab this moment? Because there's a successful path forward for Canada out of this, but we're kind of missing the mark at this point. We're getting in our own way.
So let me bring it back to, you've raised something really interesting here around post-secondary institutions, right? And the ability to kind of scale workforce systems. And one of the things I think about is, what does it take to actually scale and integrate some of this technology? But I want to bring it back to this point around the PR kind of concept that we were talking about from Canada, right? If there's no urgency, if we're not aware that there are these amazing natural resources, critical industries that we can expand and we can extract, or we can build, we can innovate, we can shape, we can be leaders, are we not telling those stories to the innovators, the pioneers, the students, the next generation, the future of talent? Are we not telling the right stories to them so they see themselves kind of in that bright, shining maple leaf way. And what I mean specifically is we were just having a conversation, I think you shared the article with me as well, about the most recent kind of Canadian company that is no longer a Canadian company, right? And has moved to the West Coast in the US. And I am just wondering, where does the story that we're telling about what we can do and how high we can climb actually factor into this narrative?
I think there's many factors, right? Like there's all the policies that surround creating a business environment where startups and scale-ups want to stay in the country. There's, many people will talk about the capital required, right? So when we compare ourselves, like, let's be honest, we're not even a fraction of, in the same kind of league as the capital that's available to startups in the US, right? So, we are a smaller country. I think we realize that, but we do, to Jeff's point, have a ton of amazing opportunities. And I think, to your point, we're not telling the story. I was recently in Ireland, and if you think about Ireland, it's a country that really has no natural resources. Until, a few decades ago, it was a very agrarian society. It had fairly kind of low compared to European standards. It was a little bit more depressed from an economic standpoint. But they made a choice, right? They said, okay, how can we change it? They changed their tax and fiscal policy. They created a strategy, to Jeff's point. They started over from a zero place, and they said, you know what? We could be a powerhouse if we change our tax strategy, we attract the right companies, and we all align to an industrial policy or an industrial strategy, and everybody gets behind and rows in the same direction. Right? I do feel like, again, and I go back, I've said this again, but maybe this is kind of explaining what I meant, is in this time, I think we need really strong leadership. And I'm looking around and I don't necessarily see it standing up. It's not that we don't have an amazing amount of opportunity. Like, we are a country that has incredible natural resources, incredible people, incredible infrastructure relatively. But I don't think we have a shared common vision about what we could be, and we're not all rowing in the same direction, if we want to use kind of a rowing metaphor. I had a very different sense in Ireland. There was a very kind of, whether they're right or wrong on their strategy, they were all rowing in the same direction collectively. But if you think about it, like, that can also be in the Ireland case, it could be a fairly brittle thing, right? So if Trump changes tax policy, it could affect Ireland. We have so many more opportunities because of the wealth of natural resources, the rare earth minerals, the water and hydro, all of the things. But I do find, for example, we're talking about nationally now building the infrastructure we should have built 30 years ago instead of the infrastructure we should build today. Like, building pipelines is important, and I would agree, but also, what about building data centers on top of natural gas, or in the north where the ambient temperature can make them more effective and more cost effective? So we have a lot of things to think through. We have huge opportunity, but we also need the leadership to go along with it. And we don't have the leadership, we risk a backlash of Canadians being disrupted, as we've talked about, and having an anti-AI kind of backlash, which is what I worry about, or our small and medium-sized businesses, which make up the majority of the Canadian economy, falling behind.
I think the thing I would add to that is doing a lot of global work and a lot of really looking at the American post-secondary environment. Mm-hmm. They talk about tech transfer. Like, when I first heard those words, tech transfer, I was like, what does that mean? Because I come from Canada, I'm a Canadian. I'm like, what are you talking about? And then every university I'm talking to is, here's our tech transfer program, I'm like, what mm-hmm. is this? Mm-hmm. Like, I hear these words and I'm like, I'm curious. I'm a crazily curious guy. Most US universities have like an incubator, like a profound incubator that's well-funded to help take student ideas and turn them into businesses. And they're very good at this. And we're not good at this. And I think that that's like the seed capital for companies is missing in Canada. Like there's some universities, of course, in Canada that do some of this okay. But as a general rule, I would guess most of our Canadian universities and colleges do not do this well. I think that's a missing policy piece. I think Mark hit on a really good one, which is we have to look at our taxation policy and say, well, how do we compare with other countries? And like when Canada was considering increasing its capital gains tax, I'm like, are you out of your minds? Like, you're already losing entrepreneurs. Do you want to push them all out of Canada? And you know, we may need the tax revenue because of government spending, but if an entrepreneur has an opportunity to scale something in the States where they pay less tax and can hire more people and grow more quickly, they're going to go. Like, so you have to understand the sort of the consequences of some of those decisions. And I feel like from a leadership perspective, Canada's missing that kind of catalyst type leadership. But just the last thing I'll say on the PR, because I think you asked a really good question. We don't tell our own stories well enough.
Well, this is what I wanted to get into, because what you're raising is almost making me think about, like, is it the fact that we don't want to brag? Like, are we too humble? Is like that Canadian humility sort of permeating the way that we think about boosting up entrepreneurialism and really just painting the vision of what the opportunity brand is here?
Well, I think it's also like we talk a lot, and one of my pet peeves in life, and you mentioned Clay Christensen earlier, is when acronyms or words are used without a definition and without an application. So I had a successful run just working on innovation 20 years ago, when everyone was talking about innovation. No one had any sort of clear understanding of what that meant. I find AI is the same now. People are like, oh, I'm working on my AI strategy. I'm like, great, what do you mean by AI? Don't know. What strategically do you want it to do? Don't know. I'm like, it's probably not going to be a great AI strategy. But I think when you get back and look at Canadian history, and obviously everyone talks about Shopify as an example, but I've been surprised doing some volunteer work with high schools. In Toronto District School Board, I did this whole program during COVID. We brought a lot of industry leaders in of great Canadian companies, and the students don't know their stories. Like a great example, like this is a non-tech, like let's get a little bit sexy in terms of creative industries. Live Nation has a Canadian CEO, is largely a Canadian founded company. It's granted it's based in the States now, but the foundational stories of that company are so grounded in Canadian history. Or if you take a Shopify, how did Shopify become Shopify?
Yeah.
Like I want to know that story. Like how are we teaching high school kids about that? There's so many businesses around us, like, and whether you're talking about small businesses or large, you have these great foundational stories about people had this idea and they worked hard at it and they had a couple good bounces. And I find most of our entrepreneurs are very open to sharing the good and bad of those stories. The ones that are egomaniacs will actually share the good and the bad of the story and the lessons learned. I'm like, who's telling those stories to Canadian kids? Because I think most of us, when we grew up, was like, you go to university and then someone hires you to do this. Like the idea of entrepreneurship, like starting like having an idea and making it happen. When we live in a world where everything around us, including like here where we are today, people invented all of this. So I'm like, why wouldn't we empower the average Canadian to think about their own possibilities in terms of building a life?
I think the entrepreneurial mindset and the growth mindset are going to be absolutely critical. And again, I think people have to see kind of a vision. If you look at different kind of demographic groups over different periods of time and what they were paying attention to or what was in popular culture at the time, you can see a lot of the shifts in, risk aversion or different things. It's really interesting to try. And yeah, I agree. We are humble. We don't like to brag. We don't necessarily celebrate as much as some other. And I think that has both positive and negative attributes to it. But I think in what we're talking about today, I think we do need to kind of come into our own and realize all of the potential we have as a country, which is massive, but it's going to take working together, collaborating, and having a vision, a common shared vision that we can work towards.
So let's as we kind of move the conversation here, what's it going to take, right? So you have kind of started naming a couple of values, I think. We could call those things vision, collaboration. What do you guys think what Canadian values can start to drive or shape this idea of moving the needle. So how we think about investing in skills, how we think about changing policies, or maybe getting a little bit more our PR correct in terms of how we think about industry and shaping the future of work. Is there something that's particularly Canadian that can be our competitive advantage to how we put those values to work for us?
That is a good question. I do think that there is, it's going to come back to what Mark said earlier, actually. Like, I think we use slogans without application. Mm-hmm. And I'll give you an example that I think is really important for Canada, and I'm proud of being a Canadian. Diversity is our strength. Awesome. How? Mm-hmm. And I'm not saying how because I don't think diversity is our strength. I'm saying how because I want to see examples of what we've done with that have been amazing. And I don't think we take the next step sometimes as Canadians. So I'd like to see the grind of like, okay, here are the examples. Here's how this is manifested. I think we are getting there. Like from a cultural perspective, I think you do see some success stories for sure. But I think if we're going to lean in on things, we got to lean in on things, right? And like, we got to make stuff happen. And I do think that's a key one. Because I think a lot of what's interesting with the AI revolution, and it's fascinating right now because the acute shortage, interestingly enough, while it's a highly innovative technology, is energy, mining, and rare earth, which are not super innovative. Like when you think about innovation and excitement, you don't necessarily think about those sectors. Mining, and I know I have friends that work in those sectors that are innovative and exciting, so I apologize to any of them that might hear this. But that's not where we naturally go with it. And so I think that there's a foundation layer that's around those things. And Canada has the natural assets to win there. So we should play and win there to accumulate wealth that we can then distribute into the more human innovative aspects. And what I'd love to see, to get to your question, is I'd love to see, and I think, again, we're not saying anything pro or con USA, but what David Sachs has done with the US administration has served as a catalyst around leading specific initiatives in the United States. We need some form of that in Canada. And I don't see it right now. I would really like to see a leader or leaders come together. I don't care if it's a group, I don't care if it's a collective, I don't care where it comes from, but it would be awesome to see people who could say, okay, here's our strat plan for Canada. Yeah. Here are the things we're gonna do. Here are the things we're gonna hyper invest in. And we are going to have to pick some winners. We are going to have to own the podium, to use that old expression from the Harper years, but to figure out where we deploy so that we can build a successful economic future for everybody. Because the reality is, if you look at countries that succeed or fail, if you are not succeeding economically, you do not have robust social spending.
That's right.
Right. And so it comes down to a quality of life conversation.
Yeah, if you want to spend money on social programs and your country is not doing well economically, at some point, there's a consequence.
Yeah. People, like, we talk a lot, or you hear news media productivity, and that's a pretty vague or opaque term to 99% of Canadians. Like, you see people's eyes kind of glaze over.
Help us understand it.
What's productivity? But I think, like, the one thing that kind of really brought it home to me, and just building on what Jeff was saying, we have almost the exact same GDP per worker as Finland. But in Finland, because of their productivity advantage over Canada, the average worker works 300 less hours a year. So would anybody in Canada love more vacation? Probably. But also, like, you could choose to spend that dividend somewhere else. Like, we're talking about, so the post-secondary system now is asking the government for more money, right? There's a lot of financial stress and strain in the system. Where does the money come from? The money will come from us being more productive, having a more productive economy, growing our GDP. To Jeff's point, it doesn't just come from the government, like, right? So if we're not individually more productive, organizationally more productive, as a country more productive, like, per hour worked, we are 30% behind the US. And that difference, that gap, is why we're starting to feel the squeeze in healthcare. It's why, if you're trying to get your aging parent in long-term care, or you're trying to get an operation in a hospital, or you're worried about the quality of maybe the building where your child is going to K to 12, like it comes from economic
Those
productivity, right? So like it's not opaque. We all really need to care about it, and it is falling, right? And so you can be in this situation where you think everything's good. We want to blame the government because healthcare doesn't seem to have enough money, but the reality is, if we're not generating that in our economy, the government doesn't have it to give back into the economy, right? It's not. It doesn't just come out of the air.
So I think this is a pretty obvious question, but I really like the way that you're kind of framing it in a very practical way. So maybe let's just follow it all the way through. If we start to do this right? There are a lot of leaders, and you guys kind of talked about a little bit of a lack of leadership, but there's leadership sitting in this room with us right now, right? And so as we think about getting this right and actually advancing some of these models, what are some of the signs that Canadians should be watching for to tell us that we're moving in the right direction?
Well, I think unfortunately, I don't like this answer, but it's true. We're going to have to spend money to make money. And unfortunately, coming out of COVID, we're not in a great position to do that, right? Because we have massive government debt. But given the sort of reorder of the world's economic systems, like I think there's a reality around investment. So if I were, as a Canadian, what I would look for from our federal government or provincial governments or even municipal governments, I'd like to see them developing investment strategies and funding that was about some really clearly articulated strategic priorities around innovation, which in the near term is probably around energy, it's probably around critical minerals and mining, and probably around AI education, workforce development, and so on. I'd like to see some big marquee initiatives around those. And I'm saying that as someone who does not like government debt, but I'm like, I think we have to do that, because I think the risk of not doing it is very significant. And what I would like not to see is a Canadian way of doing it. And I think this is one way that being Canadian works against us. We're so fairness oriented, and that's a beautiful thing about how we should treat each other, which I think should be foundational around your community and your family and your friends. When it comes to these challenges, I would like governments to find and pick good winners and really back them. I don't want to see 10,000 proof of concept small projects that aren't going to make a dent. Like we need dent in the universe type thinking right now.
Generational investments.
That was the expression from Mark Carney. So I would love to see that out of his government or any provincial or municipal government, where it's like, okay, here's where we're going to make a difference. Here's how we're going to move the needle. I'd like to see measurement against those investments. Like, here's the output we're expecting. We're going to report back on a quarter, like treat it like a company. Report back on a quarterly basis. Here's how we did. Like, I'd really like to see that needle move aggressively. And I think the government, if it stepped up that way, I'd like to see that our governments also say to industry and community leaders, we need like a coalition of the willing here. We need participants. We need people to step up, because one thing that's interesting, again, I'm not talking about the hyperbole or the rhetoric coming out of the US, but there is an extraordinary talent pool of advisors around that administration that are getting paid nothing to do pretty significant work. And I'm like, well, what? There's a Canadian recently in Ottawa who asked me, where's our Canadian version of that? Like, who are those leaders? And there are councils and all that kind of thing, but I'd like to see more of a focused effort around that so it can really move the needle.
I'd just like to say, because I think what Jeff said is really important. We have to pick winners, or certain industries we should double down on. We should have an industrial policy. I do see the federal government, based on recent conversations, moving more in that direction than I have seen in my kind of career, certainly in working. So I think, there's early signs that are promising. But I also want to highlight that 90% of our labor force and 90% of our economy is also the Main Street businesses, the small businesses, and we need to create a business environment for them where they can grow and thrive and feel like by putting extra, time in their business, it's going to benefit them, right? So we need to, again, create that culture. But it's really important that we have, that we don't just look to the new industry. I do fear the government putting a little too much emphasis on only, I think it's important, let me be clear, but only building like an AI startup and scale up ecosystem, for example, and not helping the 90% of small businesses adopt AI tools to be more productive, because that's our existing economy. So I think we need to keep both of those in balance, but I completely agree on making some big bets where we can win, where we have a unique comparative advantage, acting like, and we have many. Like, again, we're not, we have way more advantages. It's a different altogether, but say then, because of the wealth of natural resources, because of the talent that we have, because of the educational institutions, but we do need to do things differently.
Sorry, there's one more, like just side point on that. I think it's interesting. You make an excellent point, and I take it. I think the sector councils have such a key role there in terms of the small businesses, but I think it's also highly weird that we live in a time where people talk about tech companies and non-tech companies. And I'm not saying that AI is relevant to every company. It's not. Some companies don't need to really employ it, but I don't understand what a tech company is anymore. And you look at the States, you've got companies like Caterpillar, which has become a major tech company. Like, that's not a tech company, that's a tractor company, right?
Autonomous tractors,
when
autonomous
technology creeps everywhere, like, you don't think of a company as an electricity company. Or a company as a physical infrastructure company, right? Like, this idea that technology is a special class. I think you're totally right. We should be looking across industries and sectors. It's a great point.
It is an excellent point. So I'm going to wrap up with the two of you. I'd like to ask you, strictly optimistically speaking, what is the picture of Canada that inspires you? Mark, I'll start with you.
I think a future where we still have the Canadian values of valuing human-centered, like, inclusive society, where we also have the business environment to drive and support that growth and the systems that we have. I think, I don't think there's any other country I would want to live in. And I'm very excited about the potential of our future. But there is going to be some work to get to that future. But I want to live in a society that is inclusive, that brings everybody along, that has a strong middle class, that has a great business environment, but also allows people to achieve as well. So.
And Jeff, what is the picture that inspires you?
I think you can. If I'm not careful, right, when I'm thinking about this, I can too much commingle economic with society, with cultural, right? When these are different things. The economic is like a financial engine that we've invented to pay for things, to make things happen and sustainable, right? So my criticisms in our conversation today are really around economic performance of the country. And Canada's future is at risk if we don't focus on those areas, right? So I want to be very clear to distinguish Canadian cultural values and society from that conversation, right? Because I think they are somewhat different, although there's some overlap. I think that there is a really exciting future once the AI transition is more fully developed, where we are going to think about what it means to be a human being. And I think Canada, our multiculturalism, if we can really focus on being a place where we can love and respect each other and learn from each other, is going to be really important. And not being a polarized, divisive, angry, aggressive, nasty society, but it's like, I'm in love with the multiculturalism that I grew up with, which was, we welcome all, we learn from each other, we benefit from each other, and so on. So that part, absolutely. And then I think the natural wonders of Canada have tremendous value post AI robots. Like, we have areas of this country that I've been to where you go out with people who know what they're doing. I don't know what I'm doing out in the woods. If I were left in the woods, I'd end up in a very bad way. But I've gone out with people that are very seasoned backcountry people, and you end up in spots where, one of my friends in Alberta took me to a spot, and he's like, I'd guess 4 or 5 people ever have stood where we're standing right now. That's really special on earth to have that. Like, this country is so beautiful. Its people are so beautiful that I just want to make sure that the economic underpinning is there so that when we get to that age of trying to figure out humanity post-AI, that we are a leading country and a leading presence in that space.
Well, I feel like I could have this conversation for several more hours with both of you, but I want to thank you both for being here and to have this conversation with me.
Pleasure.
Thank you.